Hey again. So we are moving on to the third source in your primary source document, and this one is by Anne Bradstreet. And you're doing a comparative analysis activity. So for our last one, we specifically focused on a metaphor analysis. And with this one, I'm upping the ante a little, making it a little harder, in which there are multiple literary tools that you will use to analyze. And one thing that you'll notice is that depending on the tool you use, the resulting analysis is going to be a little different because tools work differently. If you have a hammer and a screwdriver and a wrench, these tools work differently. They have different purposes. And therefore, literary tools work very similar. I'm creating an analogy here, where depending on the literary tool that you pick, it's going to have a different purpose in how it analyzes and what it discovers and what it creates. So let's take a look. There are some terms that you need to know, and so I'm going to go over the literary terms, what they mean, but also more importantly, how they work. Because that might be what we're less familiar with, and the how they work is important to how your analysis would operate. So the first one we're going to look at is diction. And so diction is just a fancy word for word choice. So it's the selection of specific words that work together to create the tone of the writing. So with Anne Bradstreet, if you haven't looked at the writing yet, it's actually a poem. And so these are the first 4 lines of the poem, I believe. And so I'm going to use it as an example. So I'm helping you out. I'm annotating the first 4 lines for you with the diction. So if I was looking specifically at diction for these first 4 lines, the words that I would highlight are silent, rest, sorrow, thundering, piteous, shrieks, and dreadful. And so just by focusing on these specific words, I can draw conclusions, I can analyze in order to prove what it is that Anne Bradstreet is emphasizing and therefore the message she's working towards. So for instance, in the very first line where we have the diction of silent and rest, what that diction is emphasizing is the peacefulness of the evening. And so it opens with this peaceful tone. And she emphasizes that by saying, for sorrow near I did not look. She didn't expect anything to go wrong. And so while sorrow is, if you just consider the meaning of the term is sad, it's important to consider what's going on around it. She said, I did not feel sorrowful or expect sorrow, and so it's actually the opposite. And so these first 2 lines, the lack of sorrow, the silence, the rest, we open with a peaceful tone. And then there's a very dramatic shift. We go into thundering, piteous, shrieks, dreadful. It's quite the opposite. And so we have this intense shift 2 lines in that emphasizes the surprise, the startle, the intense, sudden fear, and the confusion of what it is that's wrong. Something's happened, we don't know what it is, but it's dreadful and it's loud in a very scary way. And so these diction words emphasize these elements of essentially the narrative, the plot of the poem. And so what the diction allows for us is to analyze that tonal shift and what the purpose is. The purpose of it is to mimic the sudden fear that Anne Bradstreet felt when her house catches on fire, and she wants to recreate that feeling of sudden fear for her readers by having this startling shift. So when you're analyzing diction, that's how you go about it. You look at the specific words, you talk about where they shift, how they oppose, and why the author would do that, what their message is, and what they're trying to achieve. So that's how diction works. That's the tool of diction. So now let's look at a different tool. We look at the tool of repetition. So how does this one work? What does it help create? So repetition, it's the repeating of a sound, a word, a concept, and it's usually used to emphasize the importance of what's ever being repeated and the message of that piece. And so here we have that fearful sound of fire, and fire, let no man know is my desire. And so don't worry, there's another instance of repetition later on that you'll be able to analyze. This is one instance, there's two in the poem, so look for the second one. But when you're analyzing repetition, it's actually an easier one to analyze. She repeats the word fire, and therefore she's emphasizing the importance of the word fire. And that's because it's the kind of conflict of her poem. The conflict is that her house caught on fire, which is a horrible, terrifying thing. And so she essentially wants to emphasize the conflict. Pretty straightforward analysis. She just wants to make sure that we don't miss the fact that house is on fire. All right, easy analysis there. So next one that we want to look at, our next tool, is the rhetorical question. So rhetorical questions occur when you're asking, or the author, or you as an author, are asking a question that is not intended to be answered, but rather to provoke thought in the audience. Its purpose is to help guide the thought process of the audience and encourage them to reflect upon their own beliefs. So I'm not going to use the poem itself as the example for this because there's just one instance of rhetorical questions. There's two rhetorical questions, but they're together. So it's one instance, and I want you to analyze that on your own. So I'm not going to do it for you. So we're going to look at a different example from a different text. It's from a speech by JFK. And it reads, "Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort?" And so Kennedy's rhetorical questions are addressed to the audience, and rhetorical questions almost always are. I actually can't think of an instance in which an author doesn't intend a rhetorical question to be directed at the audience. You're asking your audience, think about this. But as this little graphic points out, there's an implied yes to each question. The way it's phrased, if you say no, it makes you feel like kind of like a crummy person who is maybe a pessimist at best. And so the person or the audience, they want to say yes to these questions. And therefore, the questions aren't genuinely asked of, I really would like for you to sit down and think about these things thoroughly. Really what the speaker is doing, Kennedy in this instance, is he's guiding his audience's thought process. So when he asks a question, they're like, yeah. And then he asks another question, and they're like, yeah. And so the audience feels like they're involved. They feel like they're independently thinking, but really they're being kind of brought along on a ride in which what they think is being guided, and if you want to use a less savory term, manipulated by the speaker. So that's how rhetorical questions operate, and that's how you might analyze it. So notice the way we analyze rhetorical question is very different than how we analyze repetition and diction because they're very different tools. All right, so next one is religious imagery. So religious imagery references images and concepts that originate from religious texts. For this reading with Anne Bradstreet, as she is a Puritan, we'll be looking at biblical imagery. And so that goes along with the idea of a homily. It's specifically related to biblical texts. Religious imagery does not have to be biblical. It can be any religion. But Anne Bradstreet is a Puritan, so she'll be using similar religious imagery as Winthrop and Edwards because they're all referencing the Bible. And so, again, I'm not going to use the poem because I don't want to take away from what you might select to analyze. And so instead I've chosen a really quick quote from Romeo and Juliet, as a lot of us have probably read it. And so Juliet is speaking here, and she says, "Good pilgrim," she's speaking to Romeo. She says, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hands too much, for saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch." And so I thought this was appropriate because we're learning about Puritans, and we had some historical background on pilgrims, so it seemed to fit in. So Juliet says this line to Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, and here she compares Romeo to a pilgrim, and she's comparing herself to a saint. Very modest. And this suggests their purity. So pilgrims and Puritans are known for their purity. And so it's the idea that Juliet is saying that both her and Romeo are very pure individuals. And furthermore, when she's talking about how saints and pilgrims have hands that do touch, it's creating the image of hands meeting in prayer, so praying hands. And so what Juliet is suggesting is that their union is in dedication to God. And so Shakespeare does this to distract his audience from the fact that Romeo and Juliet are actually sharing a romance outside of wedlock, which is a no-no. So Shakespeare, he has these two young lovers who are actually sitting. And so by having Juliet compare Romeo and herself to pilgrims and saints, and by saying that their romance is essentially a prayer to God, Shakespeare is distracting his audience and creating a holy tone surrounding this love, this romance, so that the audience will support it and forget about the fact that it's outside of wedlock and instead see it as actually a holy union. And so that's the purpose of the religious imagery. Religious imagery is a much more difficult one to analyze because you have to have the biblical understanding that supports the line in order to really understand why the author's referencing what they're trying to say. And also because every reference to the biblical text or any other religious text, it can pull from anywhere in those texts. It could be saying so many different things, and therefore the analysis could go in so many different directions. So religious imagery is definitely a more difficult one to analyze, but this is an example of how you would use this tool to analyze. All right. And last but not least, metaphor. We went over metaphor with Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, but I want to revisit it really quickly. And so the purpose of a metaphor is to help us better understand a topic that maybe we're not familiar with. So we'll look at example 2. The snow was a blanket on the ground. So say I'm not familiar with snow. Maybe I live in Miami and I've never seen snow before, and I'm reading a book and it describes the snow as a blanket on the ground. That helps me perceive the snow that I've never experienced, and it helps me kind of see, if we look at this image, this kind of blanket of white, and it's very cozy and soft, and it helps me understand what snow's like, even though maybe I've never seen or touched snow. And so that's the purpose of a metaphor. And so what I would like, and what you guys are going to do in this activity is you're going to, again, take these different tools and analyze them to figure out or prove what you believe Anne Bradstreet's tone is, okay? So all of these tools work towards creating a tone, a message, a purpose. Tone, messages, and purposes are outcomes that these tools help create in different ways. Please make sure to pause now or after you're done watching this video, or at the latest right after you finish this activity, to go and add these terms to your notes so that they're in there, your ongoing notes, because you want to make sure that you keep up with the different tools that you'll be analyzing. All right, now you'll be analyzing those different tools for Anne Bradstreet's poem, but you'll also have this final question. How are the messages that Winthrop, Edwards, and Bradstreet communicate similar and representative of Puritan culture? Be specific by directly referencing the text and historical background notes. Also, despite the similarity of the message, Bradstreet's approach to delivering that message differs significantly from our previously two readings. Do you believe that Bradstreet's style would be more or less effective than Winthrop and or Edwards' style? You can discuss one or both if you want to, and make sure to be specific in your argument. So that's your final question. This should not be a sentence answer or even a few sentences. This should be many sentences, like a paragraph, or 2 if you're feeling ambitious, because you should have a lot to say about this by this point. And if you're like, oh, this is so much work, do know that all of this you'll be directly using in your final product, so it'll make the final product a lot easier to complete. All right. Cool. Well, I hope you enjoy Anne Bradstreet's poem, and I will see you later. Bye.